Hi, I'm the Director for Common Knowledge Trust, and today I want to begin to talk to you about birth stories. I've been doing a series of videos on the skills that are in the Birthing Better Childbirth Preparation online course, but I've been taking lynda.com courses about storytelling, and it's really important for me to be able to convey some of the individual stories of families who have used the Birthing Better skills. They haven't always used them at every single birth because often they didn't find the skills until after one or more births. But I want to tell you the story today about a family, Maria and her husband, Tony. Now, Maria was one of the founding families of Birthing Better in the early 70s with her husband, Tony. She had been married previously and had a 19-year-old son. And that birth had been absolutely terrible. She just hated everything about it. It had been a really, really long labor. And she was freaked. She felt out of control. She felt that the staff in the hospital where she was at were rude to her and aggressive and treated her disrespectfully. And she felt that the obstetrician absolutely paid no attention to her. And she was freaked. And she ended up with a cesarean. And she blamed everything, her husband, the situation, herself, the obstetrician, everybody. She blamed everybody for this terrible birth. Mia was freaked, and she was a solo mom for many, many years, and then she eventually met Tony. And they wanted to have more children. He was a bit younger than her, and so she felt she was getting older, and they needed to make a decision to have another child or two. And so she got pregnant. This was in the 1970s when Birthing Better was beginning to evolve. And as I said, Marie and Tony were some of the 100 families, mothers and fathers, who developed these skills because of their birth experiences. And that's why it's so important that our trust convey to you the importance these skills were to individual families. But because 100% of pregnant women give birth, then that means that giving birth is really our commonality, our universal, fundamental human nature. And we don't have skills around this incredibly dynamic, transforming experience. And Maria was a perfect example of somebody who lacked skills. And she just felt that birth was totally out of control. And she waited 19 years before she got pregnant again. So she had a lot to overcome. And Tony was a first-time dad-to-be, so he didn't understand what she had gone through. So anyway, they got pregnant, and this time they decided to work with a midwife. And the midwife had been an obstetrical nurse for many, many years, had seen thousands and thousands of births, but 99.9% of those births were families that were unskilled. And so she knew a fundamental truth. You never know what your birth's going to be like, but women get through it one way or the other. Well, that's really, God, that's just telling us that we have no control over anything. But Maria felt she had control by choosing a midwife who would give her continuity of care. And the midwife was one of those wonderful motherly women. She was older. She kept inspiring Maria and Tony that birth was fine, that this was not going to be a repeat. Now, I happened to work with this midwife. She had come to some workshops I had taught in the early 1970s about the skills as they were forming. She liked them, but honestly, she was quite skeptical about them. But she said, go ahead and work with this family and let me know what happens. So I met with Maria and Tony, and one of the things that we did was to go through the internal work, how to prepare down there. And that also helps you understand what the outlet of your pelvis is like, because your baby has to come through the inlet of your pelvis, has to move through the middle of your pelvis, and it has to come out the outlet in order to get to the vagina and then open up your vagina. And if that can't happen, if the baby can't move through your pelvis for one reason or another, then you're never going to have a vaginal birth. Now, I want you to know that I have felt the inside of thousands and thousands of women. And I have rarely met a woman who could not give birth to a baby that fit her in a relative size relationship. But a number of women, a good percent of them, have to learn to create space in their pelvis to let their baby out, because either the baby is big relative to the space or they have a shape in their pelvis that predisposes the baby getting stuck somewhere in the bony pelvis. So I did the internal work with Maria and then showed Tony. And what we discovered was that she had a funnel-shaped pelvis. She had a wide, broad inlet. Her mid-pelvis got narrower, but the outlet was very, very narrow, very much like a male pelvis. And I said to them, you have a pelvis that will never let a baby out. And that blew her away. Understandably, blew her away. So she went back to the midwife, and the midwife basically said to her, don't be silly. Women are meant to have babies, and that's just Wintergreen's opinion, and so therefore disregard it. Now, they did do the internal work, and she did disregard me, and she basically was willing to learn some of the other skills, but she was absolutely committed to having a home birth with this baby. And I was privileged to be at the birth with her and the midwife. And she labored for a very, very, very long time. And she got fully dilated, and the baby didn't come down into the pelvis. And after 36 hours, she decided to go to the hospital. The doctor checked her and said to her, you have a funnel-shaped pelvis. Your baby would never come through this pelvis, and you can have a cesarean. They did have one. They had a little girl. They were delighted, a bit confused. They really valued the midwife. They didn't know what to make of me. And the doctor, the expert, had confirmed what I had said. And I'm not qualified in birth. I'm not a midwife. I'm not a doula. I'm not a childbirth educator. But I did body work, and I had developed these skills with hundreds of families. And so we had a chance to talk about it afterwards. Now, she didn't talk with me and the midwife because the midwife felt a little, I don't know whether it was betrayed or caught up short, but she basically said, you know, it is what it is. That's what happens at births, because that was her experience as a labor and delivery nurse, and she did the best she could. But when Maria and Tony and I talked, one of the things that she said, which was really important, was she loved labor this time. That wasn't true 19 years earlier. This time she had the skills, and Tony had the skills to help her. They had the birthing better skills, so they breathed well together. She knew how to internally relax. They even knew how to try to create space for the baby. They had done the internal work. They were prepared. She loved labor. She loved labor. Yes, she was disappointed that it had ended up with a surgical birth, but she had loved labor, and Tony had loved labor. They never felt their baby was at risk. Well, 2 years later, they got pregnant again. And she was faced with a dilemma, wasn't she? The faced with a dilemma was she had now had 2 cesareans. The first cesarean had been a classical cesarean where her uterus had been cut up and down, and she had this massive scar from her navel to her pubic bone. And the doctor was very hesitant at first time to let her have a trial of labor. And when the doctor did the cesarean the second time, he did do a low-line bikini cut cesarean. And she had waited 2 years for her body to heal. And so when she got pregnant again, because she had liked the obstetrician, she went back to the obstetrician. And this is what she said to him: I like labor. I understand that I'm never going to get a baby out of my vagina, but I love to labor. How do you feel about that? How do you feel about me laboring, knowing that I'm going to have a cesarean? How do you feel about that? What do you think? And the doctor said to her, fine with me. As long as the baby's fine, not a problem. So she decided. She had the same midwife. I still was working with the midwife. We had now had 2 years of experiences with families using the birthing skills compared to families that didn't, and we saw a huge change. But to get back to Maria and Tony, that's important. she decided to labor at home again. And she did. She had a great labor. This time it was very short. She dilated in about 8 hours. And so they hauled off to the hospital. They got to the hospital. The doctor met them. He checked her, said, "You're fully dilated." And she said, "Yeah, it's been great." And he said, "Look, we know that your baby's never going to come through your pelvis. We know that. But your baby's fine. So why don't you push for a while?" And so she pushed for half an hour. The baby was never going to come through her pelvis. There's no mystical, magical, special lining to this story. But she pushed for half an hour, knowing that her baby was never going to come through her pelvis. And at the end of the half hour, she said, "I'm ready to give birth now." And they went in, and she had another cesarean. And the first thing she said after that cesarean was, "Nobody is going to tell me I did not birth my baby." Now, what do we want you to learn from this story? It's really simple. We want you to know that skills matter. This woman, when she lacked skills and her husband had lacked skills 19 years before, felt overwhelmed by the experience. And she had that anger in her for 19 years. She blamed everybody. And then she got pregnant. And even though she had information, the care provider diminished that information. And so she ignored it. But she had the skills this time. So they used the skills, and when that information turned out to be accurate, she was able to distinguish two things. One is she loved labor. She loved having the skills with her husband to go through labor. And two was she had to get real about the fact that her pelvis wasn't going to let a baby out. And that actually made her feel fine. So when she got pregnant 2 years later, she then was faced with a conundrum. Do you just go in and have a non-laboring cesarean? Or do you do what you want to do, which is to labor and then have a cesarean? The obstetrician was fine with that. As long as she and the baby were fine, he didn't care. And she had a great labor, and she got fully dilated. And this lovely obstetrician then said to her, "Go ahead and push for a half hour." And she did. And then she chose when her baby was going to be born. So what we want you to know is skills matter. Skills matter. And our resource, Birthing Better, was developed by Maria and Tony and hundreds of other families because they wanted to have a different type of birth. That didn't mean they wanted to have a vaginal birth over a cesarean, or a cesarean over a vaginal birth, or a natural birth over a medical birth. They wanted to feel that they were in control and really doing the activity of birthing their baby. And they succeeded. And this is a story I will always tell. Thanks for listening. Bye-bye.